London's Marylebone Station. Today, this is the terminus of a busy commuter railway running northwest through the London suburbs to Aylesbury. It was once the starting point for the capital's shortest-lived main line. The Great Central's new London terminus at Marylebone opened on the 9th of March, 1899. The station was built on 70 acres of land, situated just to the north of Baker Street. The station was smaller than originally conceived. It had just 5 platforms instead of the 7 planned. Plans for extensions to the station never came to fruition. We'll now go back in time, almost 25 years in fact, to the late 1960s. Marylebone ceased to be a mainline station in September 1966, when through services to Nottingham along the old Great Central were withdrawn. However, the terminus continued to play host to mainline trains due to engineering work at the neighbouring termini of Euston and Paddington. Most of these diversions occurred during the autumn of 1967. On this occasion, it was the reconstruction of the track layout at Paddington and the construction of Old Oak Common Power Box that were to cause the diverting of traffic. West of England services ran into Kensington Olympia, while trains from Birmingham and Wolverhampton ran into Marylebone. A 47 arrives at the terminus. Note the station approaches, which have changed little since the end of through services to Nottingham. Note the head codes in use at this time. The V denotes Western Region. The local services continue to operate alongside the diverted traffic. This DMU is working to Aylesbury. Now a view from above the station. To the left can be seen the site of the former goods depot. This was soon to become the site of a large housing development. This Hymek is arriving on a train from Oxford. The diesel hydraulics in use on the Western at this time was supplemented by a number of brush-type 4s. A warship arrives with a train from Birmingham. The terminus last saw this number of arrivals and departures during the 1950s, prior to the downgrading of the Great Central Main Line. Marylebone was to see similar diversions during the rebuilding of Euston Station. A brush Type 2 departs on the parcels bound for Aylesbury along the former Metropolitan and Great Central Joint Line. We'll now travel north. Marylebone was reached by a newly constructed line from Finchley Road. Here, trains would parallel the Metropolitan tracks through Kilburn to Neasden Junction. At Neasden Junction, the diverted trains took the line due west towards Northolt. Wembley Hill was on the link from Northolt to Neasden Junction. This line was constructed jointly by the Great Western and Great Central Railways as a means of providing an alternative and faster route into the capital. This scheme was part of a wider project to improve the line through High Wycombe and Princes Risborough. The line through here opened in April 1906. The station's layout was fairly typical of those on this joint line. The platforms were sited on loops alongside the main lines. Once again, express services are being diverted from Paddington to Marylebone. Note the wooden signal posts and lower quadrant signals. These will soon be replaced with standard tubular posts and arms. Wembley Hill was to retain a signal box and slow loops for many years. Although in common with many other stations on the line, the fast lines would eventually be removed. The railway and services to Marylebone have seen great change in recent years. The Chiltern lines are the suburban services left after the closure of the GC main line. The Class 165 networker turbo units are part of an extensive modernisation programme, which has seen stations upgraded and signalling replaced. As a result, this is no longer the forgotten backwater left after the closure of the Great Central Main Line. Such scenes are a far cry from the services of just a few years ago. The area around Liverpool Street has changed dramatically in recent years. The office blocks are products of the building boom of the 1980s. There were once two termini of equal importance backing onto Liverpool Street. One has been modernised, the other has totally disappeared. Broad Street was sited just to the west of Liverpool Street Station. This was once an extremely busy station. In 1900, it handled as many trains in its 7 platforms as Paddington and Euston combined. trains ran to a wide variety of destinations as far afield as Wolverhampton. The terminus was reached by a 2-mile line from Dalston Junction. It linked with the North London line, running west through Gospel Oak to Willesden Junction. The line into Broad Street opened in 1850. There was once an intermediate station, Shoreditch. This closed way back in 1940. Electrification of services from Broad Street to Watford by the third rail system was completed in 1922. However, the services from Broad Street to the Great Northern lines remained unelectrified. At Dalston Junction, there were 4 platforms. Only 2 of these had third rail. This 31 is working a peak service to Hertford North. The decline in services had left its mark on the station. The end of locomotive-hauled trains to the Great Northern lines was marked by the running of a rail tour in 1977. Note the suburban stock, which was once a common sight into the neighbouring London termini. The rundown of traffic allowed the station to be reduced to 4 platforms. Trains had been reduced to just 3 departures each hour. These used the North London route and ran to Richmond, Willesden or Watford. The large overall roof was removed from the station in 1968. These scenes were taken in May 1985. During the summer, these platforms were to be closed, and services were transferred to a temporary platform which was in use until the station's closure on the 29th of June 1986. Now to North London in the early 60s. Rather surprisingly, this area was not immune to the cuts proposed in the Beeching plan of the early 60s. The services along the North London line were earmarked for closure. These scenes were taken in 1963. Note the Class 20s from Devons Road on cross-London freight traffic. While steam had long been displaced on the North London line, an extensive steam-hauled network remained in East London into the 1960s. We'll now take a brief look at these services during 1959. An N7 passes through Bethnal Green. The majority of this class was based at Stratford Depot for the suburban services out of Liverpool Street. Seven Sisters Station and a North Woolwich train approaches. The L2s worked alongside the N7s on the suburban duties from both King's Cross and Liverpool Street. lines and stations in East London suffered their fair share of cutbacks in the 1960s. Bow Street closed to passenger traffic on the 14th of June 1965. These scenes were taken 2 years after closure. One line that was threatened with closure was the branch from North Woolwich. Serving East London docks, Canning Town was one of 4 intermediate stations on the line between Stratford and North Woolwich. The line was to be saved from the axe. DMUs had taken over from steam in the early 1960s. By the late 1960s, the line had been heavily rationalised. North Woolwich had been reduced to one platform. The run-round loops, signal box and yards had been removed in favour of a basic railway. By the 1970s, 2-car Cravens units based at Stratford had become the main motive power. The extensive and rather overgrown platforms at Custom House were built before the days of 2-car DMUs. The station here has changed dramatically in recent years. The spacious platforms and wooden canopies have long since disappeared. In 1984, the line to North Woolwich was electrified, with services being extended to Richmond via the North London line. The days of the 2-car Cravens units seem as far away as the era of the steam-worked suburban trains. The Great Central shared the Metropolitan line on its journey from the capital. The Metropolitan was hardly built to mainline standards. It was a commuter line, winding a course through the London suburbs. In recent years, the line has seen the return of steam in the form of specials operating from Harrow to Amersham. These Black Fives were once a common sight as they traversed these third rail lines on their way to Nottingham via the former Great Central route. It's August 1966, and a Nottingham-bound train heads north near Rickmansworth. The final years of through services saw trains in the hands of a grimy collection of Black Fives. These services had been downgraded in 1960, and in many ways, the Great Central could no longer be considered a main line. This was all a far cry from the final days of named trains like the Master Cutler and the South Yorkshireman. Diesel traction, mostly in the form of Type 2s, was also common on the few remaining parcels trains. Amersham marked the end of the third rail. We're now travelling north through Stoke Mandeville. Mainline trains from Marylebone could use one of two routes, either the Metropolitan and Great Central Joint Line to Aylesbury, or the Great Western and Great Central Joint Line via Princess Risborough. Once north of Aylesbury, the character of the route changed. The commuter railway became a well-laid main line. Quainton Road marked the point where the Metropolitan and Great Central Joint Line ended and the true Great Central started. The Metropolitan had reached here in 1868 in the form of a branch running from Aylesbury to Verney Junction. The Brill tramway opened 3 years later and terminated in this bay platform. These branches closed in 1935 and 1936. Complete closure of the station to passenger traffic came on the 4th of March 1963. A Black 5 heads for Marylebone in July 1966. Freight facilities at the station were withdrawn in 1967, although the line through Quainton was retained as a freight-only route. The London Railway Preservation Society chose the station as the centre of their activities in 1968. A wide range of rolling stock and locomotives has been assembled on the site, which is now known as the Buckinghamshire Railway Centre. In 1992 has seen a steamwork shuttle service operating along the former main line from here to Aylesbury. The weekend of the 30th and 31st of August witnessed the return of steam to this section of main line for the first time since 1966. The single track is still in use as far as Calvert. The typical Great Central design of a large island platform served from an overbridge was last used by passenger traffic in March 1963. Just north of the station was a spur linking with the former London and North Western cross-country line from Oxford to Cambridge. This link line diverged from the Great Central route at a junction around a quarter of a mile north of Calvert Station. These scenes were taken soon after the closure of the Great Central main line. The last train had used this rusty track on the 5th of September 1966. Brackley was the only town of any size on the line from Aylesbury to Rugby. During the final week of operation, a number of specials traversed the main line. These included Bullet Pacific 35030, A black 5 heads north on a Nottingham semi-fast through the deep cutting just beyond the station. The railway is already rather neglected, with vegetation beginning to establish along the cutting. Helmden Station was closed when local services were withdrawn in March 1963, and the station buildings were demolished early in 1966. Helmden Viaduct was situated around half a mile to the north. The 9 arches of the viaduct crossed the Banbury to Northampton branch. Services over this line had finished 15 years before these scenes were taken. Local traffic had been withdrawn in 1963, leaving just these semi-fast trains running from Marylebone to Nottingham. These called at all the remaining stations between Rugby and Aylesbury. Woodford Horse was once an important junction on the Great Central Main Line. It was the point where cross-country traffic joined via the line to Banbury. This line diverged at Culworth Junction, around 2 miles to the south of Woodford. A black 5 approaches Woodford from the south. Deep cuttings were a feature of the former Great Central. The route was extremely well engineered, with the result that there were no sharp curves and no gradients steeper than 1 in 176. A black 5 enters Woodford Station. Another black 5 approaches the station. The junction for the line to Stratford-upon-Avon can be seen just beyond the box. By the time these scenes had been taken, Woodford was in the final stages of decline. Closure was just a few weeks away. The yards at Woodford had been closed by 1966. The regular service of fast freights running from Annesley near Nottingham to Banbury had been transferred away in 1964. By this time, the station handled only around 10 through trains per day to and from Marylebone. Note the lifted yards in the foreground. The shed can be seen in the distance. Woodford Halse Shed, coded 38E, consisted of 6 lines. The track had been lifted together with the surrounding yards soon after closure on the 14th of June 1965. The overbridge, just to the south of the station, offered a panoramic view across the area. A black 5 heads towards Marylebone. Now a view from the next overbridge, this time with a Nottingham-bound train. The semi-fast trains were handled by DMUs as well as steam traction. These 8-car sets were rarely photographed. The cross-country branch from Stratford to Towcester crossed the Great Central just south of Woodford. This line had closed to passenger traffic as long ago as April 1952, although freight survived much longer. The branch was joined with the Great Central via a short spur diverging here at Woodford Junction and heading northeast. There'd also once been a south-facing link from Woodford Junction to the Great Central. We'll now travel north from Woodford. Catesby Tunnel was situated just to the north of Charlton Station. The next place of any size was Rugby. On the 5th of September 1966, the line south from Rugby through Woodford to Calvert was closed to all traffic. The Great Central was no longer a through route. Track lifting soon commenced on this section, and by early 1967, all had gone. Although the section south of Rugby had closed, the line north from the station remained open for a little longer. A passenger service operated through Lutterworth, Leicester and Loughborough to Nottingham. In contrast to the London and North Western station at Rugby, the Great Central station was a simple affair, consisting of a large island platform served from an overbridge. Interestingly, DMUs ran south from the station to gain access to the northbound platform. This train is most certainly not running to Marylebone. There was, incidentally, no connection between the Great Central and the neighbouring London and North Western main line to Euston. Note the goods shed. This still carries the company's signs. We'll now explore the line to Nottingham. The Great Central crossed the former London and North Western main line via a so-called birdcage girder bridge. This spanned a network of lines and was situated just to the south of the former LNWR station. Lutterworth was another typical island platform, although it was unusual in that it was built on an embankment and reached by a subway. This train seems surprisingly well patronised. Leicester Central occupied an elevated position. The station comprised a large island platform with bays facing both north and south for local traffic. These bays were taken out of use in 1966. By this time, the track had been removed. The next station north was at Belgrave and Bristol. This simple station had no sidings or goods handling facilities. It had closed to passengers on the 4th of March 1963. All of the stations on the line followed a standard design. Rothley's goods facilities had by this time been withdrawn and the yard lifted. Courant, like Belgrave and Bristol, had closed in 1963. Although considerable space was set aside for the development of the goods yard, only a couple of sidings were laid, and these saw very little use. The railway here passed through land owned by Lord Lanesborough. In return, the Lord insisted that he could stop any train at the station when travelling by rail to and from his country house. Loughborough was a much larger station. Goods services on the Great Central south of Nottingham were withdrawn in June 1965. The small yard here was closed at this time. The town was served by two main lines, the Great Central to Marylebone and the Midland Main Line to St Pancras. Nottingham Arkwright Street became the terminus for the line from Rugby, once Victoria had closed on the 4th of September 1967. This was to be a short-lived terminus, with complete closure coming on the 5th of May 1969. The Rugby to Nottingham service lasted no more than 2.5 years after the withdrawal of through services. Almost 25 years later, much of the route has returned to nature. Many engineering structures remain intact, although devoid of track. The track bed over Helmden Viaduct is in a remarkable state of preservation. The much larger viaduct at Brackley was incidentally demolished in 1978. Many of the substantial earthworks will survive for many years to come. There is, however, no trace of Woodford Station and its former railway facilities. Rugby's goods shed remains unaltered. However, the station buildings have been demolished, although the large island platform remains in place. Loughborough was, in 1969, in the final stages of decline. Few could have imagined that within a few years it would be transformed into a thriving railway centre. The Mainline Preservation Group was formed in 1969 with the intention of restoring the entire line from Leicester to Rugby to mainline standards. The first trains ran in 1973 from Loughborough to Corn. A few years later, Rothley became the terminus. The original objective of recreating a double-track mainline has yet to come to fruition. Bedford St John's was once the centre of a thriving cross-country line. Earmarked for development and with considerable potential, this route also succumbed to the beaching axe. The station was situated on the route from Cambridge to Oxford. It linked the main lines running from London. These comprised the East Coast Main Line at Sandy, the Midland at Bedford, the West Coast Main Line at Bletchley, and the Great Central via a link line from Verney Junction. We'll now go back to 1968 and take a journey along the line. The south-facing bay platforms were the starting point for trains to and from Bedford and Oxford. Derby lightweight units and an occasional Cravens unit provided the service. These had taken over from steam in November 1959. These scenes were taken just a few days before closure on the 1st of January 1968. This accounts for the rather crowded train. The junction for the line left just south of Cambridge Station. It followed the main line to Liverpool Street for a short distance before heading due west. The first station was at Lord's Bridge. The double track remains in place, although the stations were all unstaffed and many intermediate signal boxes had been closed. Once known for its busy freight traffic, this had been withdrawn completely from the line east of Bedford in January 1966. In fact, at one time, the Oxford to Cambridge line had been earmarked for development as a major freight line bypassing London. Old North Road was once the crossing point for the original Great North Road. Again, the box is disused and the yard has been removed. Gamlingay's disused signal box and goods shed are both in a poor state of repair. now approaching Potton. "25 years after closure, the station is in a superb state of preservation. The fine cast iron canopy survives. This was one of two structures on the line from Oxford to Cambridge. The other at Sandy has long since disappeared. There was an attempt to reopen the line from here to Sandy as a privately operated steam-worked railway. This was originally the course of a tramway. This ran through the private estate of Captain William Peel and was built to carry produce from his estate to the main line for carriage on the Great Northern Railway to London. This tramway later became part of the Bedford and Cambridge Railway. The line ran alongside the former Great Northern route on the southern approaches to Sandy. Sandy did in fact comprise two separate stations. At one time they retained separate staff. All trace of the branch station has now disappeared. The Great Northern structure has survived, and the East Coast route is now electrified. From the station, the line climbed to a bridge over the East Coast main line. From here to Bedford, the line was single track, with passing loops at the stations. This bridge was incidentally rebuilt in 1957 as part of a scheme to upgrade the line into an important freight route. This line saw a dramatic increase in traffic during the Second World War. In particular, it was used by oil traffic destined for the airfields in East Anglia. As a result, several of the passing loops were reinstated or lengthened at this time. The original station building from the days of the Bedford and Cambridge Railway is now in private use. Another loop was situated at Wellington. This station opened in 1903, and the station buildings were of London and North Western design. Bedford was once the meeting point of several lines. In addition to the Cambridge to Oxford route and the Midland Main Line, there was the branch running south to Hitchin. St John's was the centre of a number of sidings, junctions and connecting lines. The complex of buildings were to be demolished soon after the closure of the line from here to Cambridge on the 1st of January 1968. Recent years have seen the station closed completely and trains diverted into the former Midland station. Today's units pass within 200 yards of the station. The branch to Hitchin ran straight ahead, and the Oxford to Cambridge line ran from left to right. The line from Bedford to Bletchley didn't close in January 1968. The strength of local opposition forced BR to continue a passenger service. Despite several attempts in the 1970s to force closure, this section has remained doggedly open. Stations like Stuartby have changed little since the days when trains ran from here to Cambridge and Oxford. Beyond Bletchley, the line has closed to passenger traffic. This Derby lightweight is bound for Oxford. The branch from Verney Junction to Quainton Road can be seen on the left. This line closed to passenger traffic in 1936. The link with the Great Central Line at Calvert also diverges to the left. By the time Oxford is reached, we've travelled from the eastern region to the western region. On the way, we've crossed the East Coast, Midland, West Coast, Great Central and Great Western. Like many of the lines featured in this programme, much of this route has now closed to all traffic. The Great Central, Broad Street, Bedford to Cambridge, these are just some of Britain's forgotten railways.